Hi there, and welcome to this video where I'm going to talk a bit about the language of chess tactics. Now, as you know, in any language, vocabulary is very important because the more words you know, the better you will also be able to express yourself. And it's similar in chess, particularly with regard to tactics. The more tactical ideas you know and understand, and the better you understand the words we use when we're talking about tactics, the better you will also be able to express yourself on the chessboard. Now I'm going to use this position to illustrate a number of these important words that we use in the language of tactics. It's White's turn to move here, and White identified a threat. Black is threatening to capture the bishop on e3, and the reason why this is a threat is the queen is the only defender, and if she recaptures, then Black has this move, bishop to d4, pinning the queen to the king and winning material. So White identified this threat, and he decided to respond with what we call a counter threat. He played the move pawn to b4, threatening the black queen. Now a counter threat can potentially be a very strong move, but you have to be very careful whenever you're thinking about making a counter threat. And the reason why is Black is going to be thinking like this now. He will think, okay, I've got this possible threat against the knight, against the bishop on e3. If I can move my queen away and make a new threat, then I will have two threats against my opponent. And that's what Black did. He played the queen over to h5, making a new threat. He's threatening to capture the pawn on h2, which will be checkmate. Okay, so before we continue, I want to, at this point, talk a bit about targets. A target is a piece or a square that you can make a threat against. So let's see if we can identify all the possible targets in White's position here. Of course, the pawn on h2 at the moment is an important target, and because the king being nearby, the king is exposed, so the king is an important target here. The bishop on e3 we've already seen as a target. The knight on c3 is a possible target because it's under pressure from the bishop. And this bishop on c4 is also a possible target, particularly because it's undefended. Now in the same breath, when we talk about targets, we also need to talk about defenders. So the main defender of this pawn is the king, and the main defender of this bishop is the queen. So here we see a nice picture of the possible targets and the important defenders in this position. Now it's important to understand targets and defenders, because the next word I'm going to talk about is the word motives, tactical motives. A tactical motive is a known way that you can use to create new targets or to exploit the current targets in the position. Okay, so let's have a look at what actually happened now in this game. Of course, White needs to defend against the checkmate threat. He can do this by playing the pawn to h3, or the pawn to h4, or by bringing the queen to g3. Protecting the h2 pawn, in other words, he becomes a defender of the h2 pawn. All three these ideas lead to the same result, so let's make this move that White actually played in the position. And now Black could execute his previous threat. And the first motive he uses is the motive of attraction. He's attracting the queen to a vulnerable square, and then he follows up with another motive known as a pin. So when you combine different motives, like in this case White combined attraction with a pin, then we call it a combination. And that is pretty much what tactical ideas are all about. It's about combining tactical motives, using combinations that gives you an advantage. And you achieve it mainly by identifying all the targets and identifying all the defenders, and then looking for ways that you can possibly exploit them. Now, there's another very important idea when we think about tactics, and that's the idea of winning a tempo. Now, I've often been asked, what does it mean to win a tempo or to gain a tempo? And I'll go back to this position to explain what a tempo means. In chess, a tempo means a move. So winning a tempo or gaining a tempo means winning a move, or winning time, gaining time. Now the next question I often get is then, what is the difference between a threat and a tempo? Isn't that the same thing? while in a sense it is very similar, a tempo move and a threat, but there's one big difference. The big difference is that you don't necessarily have to make a defensive move against a threat. For example, in this case, white made a threat, but black wasn't forced to respond with a defensive move. Instead, he could react with an aggressive move that makes a new threat, at the same time moves his queen away from the threat, and keeps the threat against the bishop of knight takes bishop. So this is a tempo move, because it's not only a threat, but also forces white to respond in a defensive way. So that's the big difference between a threat and a tempo move. In the case of a threat, your opponent doesn't necessarily have to respond in a defensive way, but in the case of a tempo move, they are forced to respond in a defensive way. Now let's quickly look at the word sacrifice, because there are two kinds of sacrifices. The one is a combination sacrifice, and the other one is a positional sacrifice. Let's first look at the combination sacrifice. In the case of a combination sacrifice, you sacrifice material, but you know that you're going to either get the material back right away, or you're going to put your opponent in checkmate. For example, in this case, white played the move queen takes h7, sacrificing his queen. But it's a combination sacrifice because he follows up with a checkmate right away. Now let's look at an example of a positional sacrifice. A positional sacrifice is when you sacrifice material, but you know that you're not necessarily going to get the material back right away. However, you believe that the advantage you get in terms of your positional improvement is worth it. Gambit openings are a typical example of this. For example, in the Queen's Gambit, white offers up a pawn, and if black captures it, then white believes that he gets nice control over the center. Possibly later he can win the pawn back, but it's not guaranteed. But the point is, white believes that the extra control that he gains in the center is worth the material that he just sacrificed. So that's called a positional sacrifice. In closing, I want to say that possibly the most important word of all the words we've just talked about is the word motives, tactical motives. Motives being a known way that you can use to exploit targets or to create new targets. Now, the interesting thing about motives is that there are actually a lot of them. Many people are only aware of the common pins and forks, discovered attacks, and so on, but there are many more. And as a matter of fact, I made a course on the 20 most important tactical motives that you can use, and that will help you improve your tactical skill. And if you want to, you can follow the link below the video to find out more about it. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned a lot from it, and I'll see you around. Cheers.